I never thought my life would take this turn. Standing in the busy hallway of the hospital where I worked as a nurse, surrounded by the hum of monitors and the faint smell of disinfectant, I often thought about how everything began here. This was where I met Hassan, a kind, charismatic doctor with a laugh that could brighten the darkest of days. Our love story was one I thought I'd cherish forever. We married after a whirlwind romance, and when I gave birth to our son a year later, I should have been the happiest woman alive. Instead, something shifted in me, something I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion from the sleepless nights, the endless diaper changes, and the weight of motherhood. But it was more than that. The woman I saw in the mirror wasn't the Eniola I used to know. Hassan tried to understand, but how could he when I didn't understand it myself? His touch, once comforting, now felt distant. Our once passionate nights became perfunctory, like we were playing roles in a play we no longer wanted to star in. And then, the strangest thing happened. I started noticing other women. It wasn't just admiration for their beauty or confidence. It was deeper. A glance from a colleague in the changing room, the way a friend brushed her hair behind her ear, or the curve of a stranger's smile, I began to feel something I had never felt before. At first, I dismissed it. It's nothing, Eniola, I told myself. You're just tired, confused. But the feelings didn't go away. If anything, they grew stronger, more insistent, until they became impossible to ignore. One day, during a lunch break, Eniola walked into the staff room. Eniola, with her radiant smile and effortless charm, was someone everyone admired. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when she spoke to you. And when she turned that smile on me, something inside me stirred. You look like you need a break, she said, her voice warm and teasing. I laughed nervously. Is it that obvious? She sat beside me, closer than I expected, and the scent of her perfume, something floral and faintly sweet, made my heart race. We all need a break sometimes, she said, her eyes locking with mine. In that moment, the world seemed to pause. The chaos of the hospital, the noise in my head, it all faded. All I could think about was how close she was, how her laughter lit up the room, how her touch lingered just a second too long when she handed me a cup of tea. From that day on, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I saw her, my stomach fluttered. My pulse quickened. I found myself lingering in the staff room, hoping she'd walk in. I hated myself for it, hated that I was betraying Hassan in my heart, hated that I was drawn to someone who could never be mine. But I couldn't help it. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I found myself alone in the staff lounge. I was staring blankly at the wall, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't control, when Eniola walked in. Eniola, she said softly, her voice like a bomb to my frayed nerves. Are you okay? I turned to her, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Could I tell her the truth? That I wasn't okay. That my marriage felt like a prison. That I couldn't stop thinking about her. Instead, I shook my head. I don't know. She sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. You can talk to me, she said. About anything. Her touch was electric, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, have you ever felt lost? Like you don't know who you are anymore? She nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. I have. More than once. The way she looked at me, the way her hand lingered on mine, it was too much. I pulled away, standing up abruptly. I should go, I said, my voice shaking. Eniola, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to run. But I did. As I walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew I couldn't keep this up. Something had to give. I couldn't deny the truth anymore. Something inside me had awakened, something I couldn't ignore. And as much as it terrified me, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. The days after my conversation with Eniola were a blur. I threw myself into my work, hoping the long shifts and constant demands of the hospital would drown out the confusion swirling in my heart. But it didn't work. Eniola's face lingered in my thoughts, her smile haunting me in the quiet moments when I was alone. Hassan noticed my distance, of course. He wasn't the kind of man to ignore when something was wrong, but his attempts to reach me only made things worse. "Angela," he said one evening as I sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of me. "What's going on with you? You've been so distant." I wanted to tell him. I wanted to pour out all the emotions I'd been suppressing, to explain how lost I felt, how I didn't recognize myself anymore. But when I looked at him, all I saw was the weight of my guilt. "I'm just tired," I said instead, forcing a weak smile. "Work has been overwhelming." He didn't believe me, I could see it in his eyes. But he didn't press further. He just nodded and left the room, his silence cutting deeper than any words could. A few days later, I found myself alone with Eniola again. It wasn't planned, but fate, or perhaps something more, seemed determined to push us together. I was in the staff lounge, trying to drink a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, when she walked in. Her presence filled the room, and I felt my breath hitch as she smiled at me. "Angela," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "You've been avoiding me." I looked away, guilt twisting in my chest. "I haven't." "Yes, you have," she interrupted gently, sitting down across from me. "And that's okay. But I just want to make sure you're all right." Her concern was genuine, and it broke something inside me. Before I knew it, I was spilling everything: the growing distance between Hassan and me, the confusion I felt, the emotions I didn't know how to handle. I didn't tell her everything, though. I didn't tell her that she was the source of those emotions, that every time I saw her, my heart raced in a way it never had before. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and compassionate. When I finished, she reached out and placed her hand over mine. "You're not alone, Angela," she said softly. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it by yourself." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness I'd been drowning in. I looked at her, tears welling up in my eyes, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But then her tongue brushed against my skin, and the jolt of electricity that shot through me reminded me of the line I was dangerously close to crossing. I pulled my hand away, standing up abruptly. I need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Angela," she said, standing as well. "You don't have to run from this. From me." Her words stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at her, my heart pounding. "I don't even know what this is," I admitted. She took a step closer, her gaze steady. "It's whatever we choose to make it." I wanted to say something, to push her away or pull her closer, I didn't know which. But before I could make a decision, a nurse walked into the lounge, breaking the moment. I left without another word, my emotions a tangled mess. That night, as I lay in bed beside Hassan, who was already fast asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about Eniola. Her words, her touch, her presence, it was all-consuming. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path I chose, there would be no turning back. The following days passed in a haze of confusion and inner turmoil. Eniola's words echoed in my mind, tugging at feelings I couldn't suppress anymore. I found myself searching for her presence at the hospital, looking for excuses to cross her path. Yet, every time I saw her, I was struck by the same mix of longing and fear. At home, the distance between Hassan and me widened. His attempts to reach out felt like a spotlight on my guilt. I couldn't meet his gaze without remembering Eniola's smile, her touch. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me either. One evening, after another argument that ended in silence, I put our son to bed and sat alone in the living room. I stared at my phone, my thumb hovering over Eniola's number. I had saved it weeks ago, though I'd never used it. The temptation to call her was overwhelming. I needed to hear her voice, to feel the comfort she always seemed to bring. But I was too scared of what might happen if I opened that door. And then, as if she could sense my thoughts, my phone lit up with a message. It was from her. Eniola, hey, are you okay? I've been thinking about you. My heart raced as I read her words. For a moment, I hesitated. But then, before I could stop myself, I typed out a reply. I'm not. Can we talk? Her response came almost immediately. Eniola, come over. I'm here for you. I didn't think about what I was doing as I got in the car and drove to her apartment. The city lights blurred as I navigated the familiar streets, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. When I arrived, Eniola was waiting for me at the door. She was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. She looked so effortlessly beautiful, and my heart clenched at the sight of her. Come in, she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. The apartment was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. She led me to the couch, sitting close but not too close, giving me space to speak. What's going on, Angela? She asked, her voice gentle. I took a deep breath, the words stumbling out before I could stop them. I'm falling apart, Eniola. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm doing with my life, my marriage, everything feels so wrong. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and she reached out, pulling me into her arms. I didn't resist. I let her hold me, her touch soothing in a way I hadn't felt in years. It's okay, she whispered. You're allowed to feel this way. You're allowed to question things. Her words broke something inside me, and I clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder. She didn't say anything more, just held me until the tears stopped. When I finally pulled away, her hands lingered on my arms, her eyes searching mine. Angela, she said softly, you don't have to fight this alone. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you need, I'm here. Her gaze dropped to my lips for a fleeting moment, and my breath caught. I knew I should pull away, create distance before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, closing the space between us. Our lips met in a tentative kiss, and the words seemed to fall away. Her touch was gentle but sure, her hands cupping my face as the kiss deepened. For the first time in months, I felt alive. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Eniola rested her forehead against mine, her voice a whisper. We can take this slow, Angela. Whatever you're ready for, I'll be here. I nodded, unable to speak, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't run from this anymore. The days following that night at Eniola's apartment were a whirlwind of emotions. The kiss lingered in my mind, replaying over and over like a song I couldn't turn off. I could still feel her warmth, her touch, her steady reassurance. At the hospital, we were careful, exchanging only fleeting glances and subtle touches when no one was looking. But beneath the surface, an unspoken connection thrummed between us, growing stronger with each passing day. At home, however, things were unraveling. Hassan had become distant, spending longer hours at work and avoiding conversations. I could sense his frustration, his confusion about the wall that had grown between us. One evening, as I put our son to bed, Hassan came into the room. His face was tired, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Angela, he said softly, waiting until I had tucked our son in before continuing. We need to talk. My stomach twisted. What about? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what's happening with us. I don't know how to reach you anymore. I looked away, guilt clawing at my chest. I'm sorry, Hassan. I'm trying. No, he interrupted gently. You're not. And I don't blame you. I don't know how long we can keep pretending everything is okay. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain what I was feeling, but how could I? How could I tell him that my heart was pulling me in a direction I didn't understand? I need some time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Hassan nodded, his expression unreadable. Take all the time you need, Eniola. But please, don't shut me out completely. That weekend, Eniola invited me to her apartment again. She could tell I was struggling, and I didn't have the strength to refuse her offer. When I arrived, she greeted me with a warm smile and a glass of wine. You look like you need this, she said, handing it to me. We sat on her couch, the atmosphere calm and intimate. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. How are you holding up? She asked, her voice gentle. I shrugged. Barely. Hassan and we had a conversation. He knows something is wrong, but I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I want to. Eniola reached out, taking my hand in hers. You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time. Her touch was comforting, grounding. I looked at her, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt as natural as breathing. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. Eniola's hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. My heart pounded in my chest, but for once, it wasn't from anxiety. We moved to her bedroom, our movement slow and deliberate, as if we were both afraid of breaking the moment. As we undressed each other, her touch was tender, her eyes never leaving mine. In her arms, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something I couldn't put into words. When it was over, we lay tangled together, the room bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Eniola traced gentle patterns on my skin, her voice a whisper. You're not alone, Eniola. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. But as I closed my eyes, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The following weeks were a blur of emotions I struggled to process. My nights with Eniola had awakened something in me, something raw, real, and terrifying. But each time I left her apartment and returned home, the weight of my double life grew heavier. Hassan became more withdrawn. He didn't press me for answers anymore, but his silence spoke volumes. It was as though he could sense the growing distance between us, though he didn't know why. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Hassan finally broke the silence. Eniola, he said, his voice calm but firm, I think we need to talk. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. What about? He took a deep breath, leaning against the dining table. About us. About this space between us. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Hassan, But he held up a hand, stopping me. Please, let me finish. I nodded, swallowing hard. I've been trying to figure out where we went wrong, he said, his voice laced with pain. And I realized. I haven't been the husband you deserve. I've been so caught up in work, in providing for us, that I didn't see you slipping away. Tears welled in my eyes as I listened to his words. Guilt gnawed at me, but so did the realization that his self-blame wasn't entirely fair. I'm not angry, Eniola, he continued. I just want to know the truth. Is there someone else? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Hassan," I began, my voice trembling. Before I could say more, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted. "I need to take this," he said, his tongue clipped. Without another word, he grabbed his phone and stepped outside, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart racing. Later that night, after Hassan had gone to bed, I received a message from Eniola. "Eniola, are you okay?" I stared at the screen, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. Hassan knows something is wrong. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Her reply came almost immediately. "Eniola, you don't have to. Maybe it's time to tell him the truth." The truth. The idea filled me with equal parts relief and dread. What would Hassan say if he knew? How could I explain feelings I didn't fully understand myself? A few days later, everything came crashing down. Hassan had left for a work conference in Lagos, leaving me alone with our son. That evening, I decided to see Eniola. I needed her comfort, her strength. When I arrived at her apartment, she greeted me with open arms, pulling me into a warm embrace. "You're shaking," she said softly. "What's wrong?" "I think I need to tell Hassan," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep living like this." Eniola cupped my face, her eyes filled with understanding. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here for you." As the night wore on, we found solace in each other's arms again, our connection deepening with every touch. For the first time, I felt like I was finally being honest, at least with myself. But that fragile sense of peace shattered the next morning when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Is this Angela Hassan?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "I'm calling from General Hospital. There's been an accident involving your husband." The words blurred together after that. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the rush of blood in my ears. Hassan didn't survive the accident. The days that followed were a haze of grief, guilt, and disbelief. I barely ate, barely slept, my mind consumed by the weight of what had happened, and the things I would never get to say to him. Eniola was my anchor through it all. She stayed by my side, holding me through the tears and the silence, her presence a lifeline I desperately needed. One evening, weeks after the funeral, I broke down in her arms. "It's my fault," I sobbed. He knew something was wrong. I pushed him away. "It's not your fault, Angela," Eniola said firmly, her hands gently stroking my back. "You loved him in your own way, and he knew that. Don't carry this guilt, it will destroy you." Her words soothed the storm inside me, and as I looked into her eyes, I realized how much she had become my safe haven. Slowly, hesitantly, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. That night, as we made love, it wasn't just about passion, it was about healing. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully embrace the love that had been growing between us, the connection that had carried me through my darkest moments. As we lay tangled together, the weight on my chest began to lift. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: Eniola was my light in the darkness, and I wasn't alone anymore. Please share, subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories. Thank you.